Hey there, you awesome people! I hope your day has been nothing short of fantastic. Welcome back to a brand new episode of What If Deku Had Green Lightning. Don't forget to shower some appreciation onto the incredible author responsible for this fanfiction. The link is conveniently waiting for you in the description box down below. If you're totally vibing with this what if scenario, drop me a comment and let your thoughts be known. And while you're at it, don't miss out on other mind-blowing what ifs on this channel. Alright, without further ado, let's dive straight into this video. Yui was quiet. It wasn't particularly uncommon, considering it was a school and people did in fact sleep. But there was nothing like the silences that would carry throughout. It was a common sight to see Nizu walking from his office to the building that just detached from Recovery Girl's office. It was a small detachment, and only a few people were allowed in. But for those that were, they spent a lot of time there. Bakugo spent his time doing work there. Sometimes he'd explain various concepts that were more complex that they had gone through in class to the near motionless body that the room permanently housed. At the end, he'd always tack on the statement, "But you probably would pick that up immediately anyway, you fucking nerd." He'd be joined by Yaoyorozu, who held his hand tightly. The black-haired girl was often found by Bakugo's side, the two always holding hands. Whilst Yaoyorozu was not nearly as affected as Bakugo was, she was definitely horrified as she came to full grasps with the horrors of the line of work she had signed up for. Was she going to give in? Absolutely not. But she sure as hell was going to take it more seriously. She began doing more training outside of classes and with Bakugo when he felt up to it, which was probably every few days. She understood why he was doing so badly, and wasn't going to push him to do better. She was surprised he was doing as well as he was. Whilst he was quieter, he still retained a surprising amount of his abrasive personality, and she would stay by his side. Tamaki and Mirio were both inseparable. They would occasionally visit but knew there wasn't going to be much change for a long time. They would love to spend more time there but both knew that Nejire needed her own time there. The two spent most of their time in the 3A dorms, helping look after Eri and doing their best to stay positive. A lot of free time was dedicated to training together to get stronger, get faster, get smarter, just getting better. After all, they both knew that they had a long way to go to match Izuku. Nizu felt incredibly guilty, not because he was involved but because he knew what Izuku would do and he couldn't stop it. Not only that, but he should have been able to think of a better solution. And he can't help the boy in his current state any further. What made it worse was that he didn't have that much time to dedicate to helping Izuku, with a collection of media, and of course running the school. Whenever he could, however, mostly during the school day, he would take some of his more mundane paperwork to do in the room. After all, it was his best chance to truly consider any potential solutions. But worst of all was Nejire. Nejire was a wreck. She spent all the time she could in the room, including sleeping in there on weekend nights when the teachers weren't so worried about the students' sleep. Her quirk was too volatile to try and awaken Izuku as she had done previously, and his state too turbulent to try something so extreme safely. The students who were friends with Nejire noticed many small things about her during the school day, when she was around them. She wasn't as energetic or quick to things anymore, and her smile and laughter was limited and incredibly polite. It was hollow to what it used to be, and evidently, her admirers had decided with Nejire's boyfriend injured badly now was the best time to ask her out. She had become decidedly harsher with rejections. Whilst she used to only say no, the way she now pointedly glared at them, said no and proceeded to pull out her phone and block them on any and all social media was incredibly harsh. For those who continued to be persistent, at least immediately after, would be dealt with somewhat violently. Recovery Girl had never had more annoying patients that deserved it so much. Nejire didn't get much sleep, plagued by nightmares and dark thoughts. She slept best when sleeping in the room that housed Izuku, even with all the machinery. She was comforted by his presence, and everyone was always waiting for tomorrow. Because hopefully tomorrow would be when everything was better. The only problem with tomorrow is that it never arrives. Eri was told about 2 days after the incident when she asked when Papa would be home. And Nejire couldn't honestly tell her that Izuku was still busy. "I sniff Izuku is very, very sleepy right now, sweetie, okay?" Nejire said, her voice cracking slightly on the end. He'll be asleep for a little while. And he'll wake up when he's ready, yeah? Okay. Eri responded with a smile, the innocence of a 6-year-old almost physically manifesting in that moment. Nejire bit her tongue to stop herself from crying more. There had been lots of that lately. She quickly scooped Eri into a tight hug, but the little girl did not respond with any confusion and just hugged back. But every time she asked from that day on, Nejire would feel her heart break further as she did her best to say with a happy face, "Ask me again tomorrow, Snowball." And so Yue carried on, for what felt like the longest time. In reality, fairly little time really passed. Yet every second felt like hours, every hour felt like days. Nejire was the worst affected by this. She could hardly stay still or focus if she wasn't by Izuku's side. She was being dragged down day by day, week by week. Hound Dog had been doing his best to help the students affected, but there were so many, and he just couldn't manage it all. Soon, or forever later, a week passed and there was very little change. Recovery Girl was working overtime to try and get Izuku to reach a better stable state, whilst the students trudged along through their schoolwork. The teachers noticed, very quickly, a partial grade drop in most students affected, with some, unsurprisingly, affected worse than others. Each teacher was affected in their own way, reaching all the way to Power Loader's class, with his usual pink-haired maniac being far more tame. Relatively speaking, her designs were far more thorough, and it seemed as though she had taken some inspiration from the comatose student to heart, with each item having an incredibly specific use for heroes and quirks. Unsurprisingly, a lot of students associated with Izuku spent a lot of time together, Misery finding a way to bring them all together. Another week passed, and these students had started working on a plan. Frequently they were found in the workshop, a specific whiteboard with a gadget they were collectively designing. In theory, it would utilize Nejire's quirk to try and stabilize Izuku's energy levels, and yet, nothing! We have been working on this for almost 2 weeks now and still nothing! Nejire screamed in despair, fresh tears rolling down her face. Nejire, Mirio tried to calm her, but she cut him off. No! Surely there's something. Anything! If the way he twitches in his sleep is any sign, he's still in pain from injuries he suffered and burns. But we can't do anything because we can't get him fucking energy! Nejire yelled, her quirks subconsciously activating as her hair began to rise somewhat. I know it's frustrating, Nejire, but there's only so much we can do, Tamaki said from his spot next to Mirio. They were all sat in a circle of chairs with Hatsume at the head by the whiteboard. Nearby was Shinso, followed by Todoroki and Ida. Then next to each other were Yaoyorozu and Bakugo, the latter of whom had taken a much more quiet approach in despair. On the opposite side were Tamaki and Mirio, whilst Nejire was currently standing. Suddenly, the door slid open, much to the surprise of the students. I believe I may be of assistance, Niza announced, a dry smile on his face. It wasn't quite his normal smile. Instead of the usual near-brimming smile on his face, he sported a stricter smile that was thin and lacking. In one hand paw, he held something. His hand/paw closed around it. He opened to reveal an energy storage. Miss Hato, if you can charge this storage, I believe we may have a solution, Niza told her, holding it with an open palm. Nejire quickly ran over and picked it up, thanking Niza over and over as she put one hand on each end of the device. She breathed in and out, zoning out the rest of the room as she tried to calm and begin flowing her quirk through it. Meanwhile, the other students were working with Niza to collect various pieces from around the workshop. There was a project sitting in one of the many cupboards that Niza specifically got Bakugo and Mirio to lift. It's very heavy and probably very fragile. Please place it on one of the workshop benches, Niza told them as he got Shinso to help him hop onto one of the tables so he was close to eye level. He then told Hatsume to collect a blueprint from within Power Loader's desk as he got Tamaki and Yaoyorozu to collect various materials from around the room. The once tense room was now a flurry of activity. Soon, where there was once an empty desk was now a blueprint with a mess of materials and a large, complex device with a large car battery next to it. Now, thus far, this has almost used this entire battery for the purpose of simply maintaining this fragment of energy. As such, it would be completely impractical to try and generate more energy. This energy is in the form of Izuku's lightning, in theory, with Hato's quirk as she has done previously. And such, she is most likely to be able to rejuvenate him with enough of her quirk energy stored and charged, Nizu explained to the students. Nizu began instructing the students with the blueprint, Hatsume doing the fine machinery work whilst the others were doing general labor. such as holding bits and pieces or moving around the machinery as required. "I got it!" Nejire declared, the most excited she'd sounded since Izuku was injured. In her hand she held the bizarre battery pack which was now buzzing slightly with energy. "Good job, Miss Hato! Now, if we take that and put it between the converter and igniter, we should get a complete circuit," Niza said, and Hatsume took the battery pack and hooked it up carefully. She went over all the wiring and nodded, holding a remote in one hand and in the other she picked up a charge measurement that she and Izuku had designed specifically for testing with his quirk when they were working on his costume, and they saw the contraption feed out a tiny amount of energy. It was measured at a relatively small amount, and Nejire felt all her hopes suddenly be drained out of her like water from a bath. She collapsed to her knees and was on the verge of despair when Niza spoke up, a slightly more hopeful smile on his face. "This is exactly what I expected," he said, clapping his paws excitedly and pulling the battery pack out, catching Nejire's attention. Part of her wanted to scream at him for intentionally misleading her, but she knew the principle was better than that. "Miss Hato, if you could please fill this again, but this time, you need to condense your energy further," Niza exclaimed happily. Nejire understood immediately. Her quirk naturally spread out, however with more effort, she could condense it to make stronger blasts and take up less space. She quickly jumped up and took the pack and held it end by end. She sat at one of the desks and gripped it tightly, her yellow spirals of energy wrapping around her arms as they fed them into the device. The device began shaking slightly as Nejire began packing it with energy. Within the device, once it was volumetrically full, Nejire increased the output of her energy to force it to condense, and effectively double how much was in there. She wasn't sure how many times she did it, but her focus was undeterred as she forced more and more into there. It was at the point she was sweating, her knuckles white from the grip. Suddenly, a small pair of arms wrapped around Nejire's waist. "Mama, it's okay," Eri said, snuggling into Nejire's back. "Papa will wake up soon." Nejire realized that it was just her, Eri and Nizu in the workshop. The contraption had been taken elsewhere. "You have been quite focused and stressed, Miss Hato, and understandably so. I called little Eri here to get you to break out of your trance. The conversion contraption has been hooked up to Izuku, so if you would put Eri to bed I will then help install that," Nizu said, rubbing his paws together. Nejire nodded, handing the pack to Nizu, who started making his way out of the room. The blue-haired girl then scooped up Eri into a hug, and began carrying her to Nejire's bedroom, where Eri had been staying. Nejire pressed her forehead to Eri's, who giggled and did the same. Nejire tucked Eri into her bed, kissing the little girl on the forehead before turning on the gentle nightlight that slowly transitioned between pastel blue and pastel green. Once she did so, she turned the light off and closed the door, and ran to Izuku's room in the infirmary. Outside there, she met Nizu, who was waiting calmly, sitting on one of the chairs and holding the power cell. "Principal Nizu?" she asked, and he hummed in response, hopping off the chair and opening the door. Despite Nejire's current hope, the scene of the still Izuku covered with hospital bandages laying on the bed would be a scene that would never leave her, and it definitely depressed her slightly when entering the room. The noise of hospital machinery, and the sheer amount of it Izuku was connected to, was not helping matters. The new one he was hooked up to, after getting it cleared by Recovery Girl, was the one they designed and built today. Or at least built today, rather it had been designed for a long time. He was hooked up to the new one with a series of wires, connected around his body to various locations. On his arms, chest, and legs. These were connected to the machine, which was currently switched off. It had a gauge for how much it was putting through to keep it at safe levels. Niza put the energy storage into its compartment, set some dials and nodded to Nejire to start the machine up. Nejire flicked a switch, and a new, louder hum filled the room. A few seconds passed and green lightning began passing through Izuku's body, wrapping around him. It was nothing like his unique iridescent emerald, instead it was a dull green. And it lacked the momentum of his lightning, the artificial one moving almost lazily. "Now what?" Nejire asked, nervous but for the first time in a while incredibly hopeful. "Now? We wait for tomorrow." Nejire woke to find a slight weight on her stomach. She gently raised the covers to find Eri was sleeping there, probably having had snuck into the bed sometime during the night. The little girl had, although she used to be alright on her own, After discovering the extent of Izuku's injuries, she had started struggling a little more. Nejire smiled somberly as she began waking up, cuddling Eri a little and leaving the girl tucked in as she carefully slipped out from underneath her. She did make sure to put the pair of stuffed soft toys of herself and Izuku in their respective hero costumes in her place though. Yaoyorozu was an absolute saint, and not just because she could put up with Bakugo as much as she did. As she changed out of her pajamas and into a casual shirt and pair of shorts for the day, she stretched. And as she finished waking up, she remembered. She rushed down the stairs ignoring the yells from her classmates. Probably the first time she had ever skipped breakfast as she began flying as soon as she left the building, the yellow trails of her energy quirk behind her as she zipped across the school. It took less than a minute for her to make it to the infirmary. Normally Recovery Girl would be there, but not at this time of morning. After all, the youthful heroine needed her beauty sleep. Nejire, however, stood outside the door to the infirmary for several minutes, pacing. She wanted to know, but she was so scared. Of both bad and good. If he was still asleep, and it hadn't had worked, she didn't know what she would do. Probably cry a lot again. Probably be found by Recovery Girl, partially dehydrated again and passed out by Izuku's side. But if he was awake, she'd be excited, ecstatic, jubilant. But she wasn't sure what she'd do. Laugh? Smile? She wasn't quite sure. She took a deeply breathed in and swung the door into the infirmary open, making her way down the unfortunately all too familiar halls through the infirmary to Izuku's dedicated room off to the side. At some point they had started writing small get-well wishes on the walls there, friends, family, classmates and teachers alike. It was sweet. Everyone had their unique writing or message. There was plenty of permanent marker, some paint, a welded one, lots of bits and pieces here and there. Nejire felt somewhat hopeful again, and dared place her hand on the doorknob. She gripped it tightly, her knuckles widening slightly before releasing a breath she didn't realize she was holding. She gently opened the door and refused to look forward, keeping her eyes firmly on the handle as she closed it, turning with it after having crossed into the other room. "Nejire?" a voice rasped. It was incredibly dry sounding. She could basically feel the dryness of his throat, but it was an unmistakable voice. It was Izuku's. Nejire was shocked, at a standstill. Tears were landing onto the floor. And there before her, lay Izuku in the hospital sheets and bandages. "What here?" Izuku asked, breaking Nejire out of her thoughts. She wanted desperately to be selfish, to take him in her arms and never let go again, to kiss him until she needed air. But she didn't know how long he had been awake, how long he must have been stuck there, uncertain, probably scared, unable to do anything but lie and sleep. But he had probably slept himself out. She nodded quickly and ran off to get a bottle of water, one of the many Recovery Girl always kept around. She held back more tears as she rushed back to Izuku's side, gently helping him drink the water. After doing so, Nejire sat in silence by Izuku's side, whose breathing shallow and somewhat labored. He couldn't sit up on account of injuries and all the machinery connected to him, nor could he turn his head, but his eyes were looking at Nejire best he could. Nejire felt like it was the first time seeing him injured all over again, Izuku helpless before her, and all she could do was cry. She began sobbing into his chest, and felt his incredibly scarred hand gently run through her hair. It was probably one of the best feelings since his comatose state. His hand was shaky and unsteady, but it was the most reassuring thing to her. Nejire wrapped her arms across Izuku's body, still sitting by his side as she gently held him, her face buried in his chest and tears soaking his bandages. He didn't care and neither did she. Both were just happy to be together properly again. Nejire wasn't sure how long had passed. It was probably a while, all things considered. She was just lying peacefully on Izuku's chest, listening to his heartbeat, and feeling his chest rise and fall with his breathing as he gently stroked her hair. And they just remained in each other's presence, embracing the comfortable silence. Eventually Recovery Girl came in to see the sight of the two, causing her to chuckle slightly, and asking Nejire to move briefly so that she could check up on Izuku. Nejire did so after a moment of hesitation, still remaining just next to him however as Recovery Girl moved the bed down and began to unravel some of the bandages. It was a slow process, one that Izuku was wincing throughout as he had to raise and lower his body in various ways to assist the process. Nejire helped Recovery Girl with shifting Izuku, and also helped the boy cope with the pain. Part of the reason Recovery Girl gave Nejire this job was because she knew that the girl would be single-minded about it, focusing on that so Recovery Girl could assess the injuries without Nejire freaking out. After all, they were bad injuries. Dozens, if not hundreds of scars would litter Izuku's body forever. Some were worse than others, but in general they were fairly shallow. Recovery Girl could tell that Izuku was more than aware of the extent of his injuries, as he looked a little pale. And that definitely wasn't due to any other reason for it. He cast his eyes away from the injuries on his torso as the bandages continued to be unraveled all the way down to his waist, the normally not squeamish boy feeling a little queasy. Recovery Girl did let Niza know that the boy was now awake, however gave him the role of collecting Izuku to stop any other students suddenly entering whilst they were in the process of removing the bandages, and before Izuku could either cover up or get really comfortable with his many new scars. After taking the bandages off, Recovery Girl sent Nejire off to bin them whilst passing Izuku a hospital shirt, one that would be loose and not rub against his injuries whilst being enough to hide all his injuries, as it was long sleeve. And the moment Nejire returned, a wave of people followed her. First off was, unsurprisingly, Bakugo, followed closely by Yayorozu, who was scolding him a fair amount. Following closely was Tamaki, carrying Eri and Mirio. Then came in Niza on Aizawa's shoulder, all to be scolded by Recovery Girl, who was yelling at them viciously, except for Eri, who she let through because Eri melted everyone's hearts for daring to disturb her patient who was literally until hours ago in a coma and whose injuries weren't even close to being healed. Meanwhile, Eri was gently hugging Izuku whilst Nejire was holding the boy's hand, who was still lying down on the bed. But even then, he smiled. He was happy. Days passed and Izuku was visited by classmates and many other teachers, all leaving him with small wishes. With each passing day he got better, and Eri was always by his side. She often helped Recovery Girl doing small things, helping feed Izuku, and keeping him entertained, and Izuku would admit, she put on very dramatic and pretty darn good puppet plays. Nejire would be there whenever she could, however she still had to stay on top of schoolwork, something she hadn't really been doing so well lately. The teachers understood, but now that he was awake she needed to catch up. This meant she would be in the same room before and after school, always holding Izuku's hand as she went through the work she had to, ranging from maths to ethical questions. It was a small gesture, but he really appreciated it. In a sense, it was grounding. It brought his mind off the pain of his injuries, and helped him smile more. Recovery Girl had steadily begun taking him off of the painkillers to avoid any potential issues. But it did mean he was becoming more aware of the pain. Recovery Girl had warned him that it would last a while, but it was going to be grating on his mental health. This was something she had already made Nejire and a few of his close friends aware of, that it may eat him from within, even if not literally. But the sweet smile of Nejire, and Eri's beaming one would definitely inspire him to give a shaky one back. Soon a week passed and Izuku was able to sit up without causing any pain, beyond the constant slight pain of his wounds. After Recovery Girl had performed an MRI scan on him, she cleared him for extremely simple work, as to not stress him too much that may cause him to unconsciously activate his quirk or any drastic change in any other vital signs. And so, he was helping teach Eri some basic maths and comprehension, only sitting up for so long before the little girl insisted it was time for him to rest. Funnily enough, it was whenever they got to division or spelling, but Izuku let it slide, at which point she would cater to his food and drinks, only incredibly simple foods at this point, so Lunch Rush had taught Eri how to do things like cook rice, which was adorable because the little girl couldn't even reach to the counter with the rice cooker on it, so she needed to use a step, and read to him some of her stories. Some were more simple, some a little more complex, and he'd have to help her with the new characters, but she persevered. It was inspiring in its own way, honestly. Another week went by and more progress came along steadily. He was still bound to the bed, but Nejire had gotten back on top of her work, so, when Eri wasn't looking, would pepper Izuku with kisses, because frankly she missed being able to do that. Whilst he wasn't really able to respond, the blush on his face said it all to his girlfriend, who just giggled and beamed. With the passing of the third week, Izuku was starting to be able to do more things. The pain was still there and slightly wearing at him, but he managed to get himself to do some of the class work he missed. Although Nizu assured him that he didn't need to worry about it as he was well ahead of literally everyone in the school, including most teachers, eventually he convinced Nizu to let him do some theory work, simply talking to some of the teachers in various subject areas. Nizu chuckled slightly as he remembered how ectoplasm had returned after an hour-long session, the normally more stoic hero heading straight to the staff room couch and collapsing. Telling them how Izuku was excitedly talking to him about the mathematical theory that meant Izuku would be able to precisely predict how much energy he was using on a basis depending on his throughput, and especially appreciated Aizawa yelling across the room from his sleeping bag, "That's why he's a problem child." And as the first month came to a close, Izuku was able to, with Recovery Girl's very, very watchful eye, he was allowed to stand, and for the first time in over a month, was able to leave the room. With Nejire by his side, he watched the sun set with a tearful eye, ready for the new day to dawn. Izuku yawned as he rolled over in the bed. Or at least he tried to. He was firmly locked on his side by a tight pair of arms around his waist. He looked down to see mostly sky blue, along with the soft gray of the quilts. And of course the arms around his waist. The sky blue hair wrapped around him, almost like a scarf, was surprisingly comfortable though. "But, Nejire, come on, we gotta get up soon," Izuku mumbled, his eyes still heavy. He felt Nejire mumble something, her head buried into his back, as she pulled Izuku tighter towards her. He vaguely heard something along the lines of 5 more minutes, but wasn't quite sure. He chuckled contentedly, eventually managing to turn around in Nejire's arms and facing his girlfriend. She pushed the side of her head into his chest, snuggling tighter into him, and Izuku smiled blissfully, carefully bringing his arms to hold her closer and gently stroke her hair. "Nejire, come on, we need to get up." "No we don't, it's the holidays," Nejire mumbled back. She was correct. Either of them needed to take Eri to school, and for Izuku it was his mid-semester holidays of the 3rd year. Nejire had officially graduated UA and started her heroics, a fully fledged sidekick to Ryukyu, and was going to open up an agency soon along with Tamaki and Mirio, who were both sidekicks to Fat Gum and Night Eye respectively. The two of them were currently at Nejire's studio apartment, a small apartment in a large block of flats somewhere just on the outskirts of the city. Izuku had gotten permission from his adoptive parents to stay with Nejire for the holidays. Both of them were very supportive, even if his mother was more than fond of teasing the two. Although she did remind them, mildly suggestively, that she didn't want to become a grandmother to more children just yet. Eri was more than enough for now, as she would relentlessly tease them. Speaking of the little girl, who had definitely started growing taller but she would always be little to everyone else, had started proper public school. This had taken a long time for Izuku and Nejire to settle on one, trying to find one that would definitely be good for her. Trawling through reviews and going to dozens of tours in between their schoolwork, although Izuku definitely had the free time to do so, considering his level of advancement. As such, after another a long time of eventually managing to convince Eri to give it a shot and see if she liked it, the two walked her to her first day of school. And much to Izuku and Nejire's happiness, when they came to pick her up from the school they had finally settled on, she was excitedly talking to a small group of her friends, all of whom had eager smiles on their faces, and Eri retold various stories from the many pro heroes she had contact with on a regular basis. Although, they did have to do their best to ignore the curious stares from other parents, considering Eri's age and the teenagers' ages. Well, adoption in their circumstances wasn't the most common. In fact, Izuku was fairly certain it was probably one of very few cases in Japanese history. That wasn't important though, as the rest of the world faded away as the little family walked Eri back to UA, the girl being swung in between the teens as she wore her green and blue backpack, courtesy of Yayorozu. And of course, this meant Eri was on holidays too. So, wake up! A little bundle of happiness threw the door open and ran up to their bed, before bouncing onto it, landing on top of the cuddling couple. Izuku chuckled whilst Nejire mumbled in slight annoyance, even if she wasn't serious about it, as she smiled happily. She kissed Izuku one more time before grabbing Eri and pulling her into a tight hug. "Mama! I wanna play!" she whined as Nejire pulled Eri between her and Izuku, where both could hug their little girl. "Sure, no, cuddle time," Nejire said in response, squeezing Eri and Izuku tighter, causing both to giggle. Eri playfully tried to push away as Nejire held them, before Izuku spoke up. "If you let us go, I'll make pancake." Izuku started, before he was cut off. No sooner than he had almost finished the sentence was he pushed out of bed by both Eri and Nejire, causing him to land on the floor. At least it was carpeted. "Eri, I thought you were on my side," Izuku playfully complained from the floor. "Not anymore." "Pancakes," Eri cheered. "Your daughter has the correct priorities. You promised pancakes." Nejire teased him, and Izuku chuckled before getting up and surrendering. Alright, I'll go make pancakes." Izuku chuckled as he went to the kitchen. From there, within Nejire's apartment, the view was fairly nice. It was towards the top of the apartment block, so it was less obstructed. He looked out over the city. Part of him wanted to go and just fly. It was something he did whenever he could. There was something about that feeling that would never get old. It always felt like his first time flying again, but he smiled contentedly as he began mixing ingredients and made pancakes for his little family. Hawks had given him the holidays off of his internship, and as such he wanted to spend as much time as possible with those that made him happy. After all, there was nothing better in life than that. A few minutes later, he called out to Nejire and Eri and served up pancakes. And they were happy, because the holidays had started. Izuku and Nejire had decided to take Eri out for a day to just de-stress. They went to the nearby park, a quiet little one not too far from their house. There weren't normally heaps of kids there. It was more focused on nature, but Eri really enjoyed it all, running ahead and looking at all the flowers and plants whilst Izuku and Nejire walked not too far behind, hand in hand. They all wore casual clothes, nothing particularly fancy, as they made their way through the plants until they reached a small pond area. Normally there were a few ducks there that they would bring bread to feed, a loaf of which was being carried by Eri, before they'd go to a picnic table. Although, this time when they got there, Eri already there, giggling as she was surrounded by little fluffy ducklings. She beamed and giggled and cheered happily as she fed each and every one of them crumbs from the palm of her hand. Sometimes she would bounce slightly as some of them rubbed against her hand, feeling the fluffy feeling of their feathers against her. Nejire got her phone out to take a video of it, beaming herself whilst Izuku gently leant on her arm. They smiled happily as they watched Eri play with the ducklings, who, as the little girl got on her knees and leant down to their level, rubbed excitedly against her cheeks. Eri giggled more and more, excitedly petting several whilst others continued to rub against her cheeks. Izuku and Nejire smiled and walked to a nearby bench where they could still see what was going on, leaning on each other as they talked. They didn't talk about anything important. Really, they were just enjoying each other's company, hand in hand and head on shoulder. Eventually Izuku went over to get Eri so they could keep going, as the ducks and ducklings had started leaving and Eri was just humming happily by the waterside. "Come on Eri, let's keep going," he said as he held out his hand for Eri to grab. She did so and pulled herself up with a little hop as Nejire walked over to them. Nejire walked to the other side of Eri and grabbed her other hand, and together the little family continued through the park. It was late in the afternoon when Nejire was carrying a floppy and tired Eri home whilst Izuku had their takeaway dinner. Eri snuggled into the crook of Nejire's neck as she was carried on Nejire's back. The sky was a beautiful orange color as they made their way through the streets. It was the weekend, but due to the sheer nature of where they lived there were people only just leaving home to work the graveyard shift. On the way, Izuku saw Shinso slinking through some alleyways under Aizawa-sensei's watchful eye. Once they made it to Nejire's apartment, Nejire went to put Eri to bed and Izuku went to the kitchen to put dinner on the counter. They had gotten noodles. He was doing some small chores in there as he prepped the table when he felt a pair of arms wrap around his waist and Nejire's body on his back. He smiled and turned to kiss her, before she giggled and released him. Together they sat and ate dinner whilst Eri was sleeping. They moved to the couch and snuggled as they watched the news, Izuku keeping tabs on various movements in both hero and villain society. With a power vacuum still in villain culture, he had to keep a careful eye on what was going on. Nejire also helped, the two incredibly inquisitive heroes working together to note everything they needed based on the day's encounters. Some villains seemed to be making more of a name for themselves whilst others were being shut down. Overall though, the heroes were definitely staying on top of everything as a collective, and whilst there seemed to be an organization trying to fill the shadows, Niza had recently begun taking a more active role in Heroes Society as an organizer for the heroes, and in general as someone who the heroes could rely on as a tactician. Izuku couldn't help but wonder if things were different. Maybe that's the kind of role he would have ended up with, but it didn't matter. Izuku turned the T.V off with a press of a button as he and Nejire got ready for bed. They were lying there, facing each other. Izuku smiled, and Nejire did as well, the two leaning in, kissing and cuddling. "See you tomorrow," Izuku whispered as the world of sleep took them, and although Nejire may have rolled her eyes, he could tell she was trying not to laugh. "To tomorrow and beyond, my love," Nejire responded as she wrapped her arms around Izuku's waist. To tomorrow and beyond. As it turned out, beyond contained many things. Children of their own, who Eri adored greatly and would always be the amazing big sister to them, and eventually a surprisingly peaceful retirement. And as the two lay outside on the grass in their retirement home in the country, living with several other retired pro heroes, their closest friends and family, they would just watch the clouds pass, hand in hand. Finn. Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible journey today. I hope you enjoyed exploring the fascinating what-if scenario of Deku. The possibilities were truly mind-blowing. If you found this video entertaining, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel. Your support means the world to me and inspires me to bring you more captivating content in the future. Stay tuned for more exciting what-if stories and other amazing videos coming your way. Until next time, take care, stay curious.